At its height, Manichaeism stretched from Atlantic harbors to Pacific palaces, a daring, syncretic faith that tried to stitch Persia, Rome, India, and China into a single moral map of light and darkness. It promised a unified cosmos and a universal answer to why the world aches. Augustine's inner voice would later admit 9 years under its sway. And that confession is our first clue. This was not a local cult, but a transcontinental idea that entered minds and would not disappear with its institutions. Here is the surprising claim. The religion died, but its framework survived. The same polarity of light and shadow reappears in Jung's archetypes, Freud's conflicted psyche, and even in Star Wars galactic mythmaking. A supposed heresy, crushed by empires, quietly became scaffolding for modern thought. If you want to understand how an extinct, faith-seated psychology, storytelling, and global religion, and why ideas often outlive the institutions that birthed them, watch closely. In minutes, we'll trace how a lost church taught the world to think about the inner war between darkness and light. Atlantic to Pacific, one religion, now heresy. From the western Mediterranean coasts to the Pacific littoral of China, Manichaeism staked a claim to universality that read as both missionary program and metaphysical manifesto. Its scriptures and liturgies circulated in Syriac, Middle Persian, Coptic, Parthian, and Chinese fragments, and its communities left artifacts and written traces across trade routes that stitched continents together. Missionary networks rode caravan and maritime corridors, bringing a dualist cosmology, light versus darkness, spirit versus matter, to urban centers and frontier settlements alike. The scale was not merely geographic, it was conceptual, a single, portable story meant to encompass every human condition from the slave market to the imperial court. Augustine's own interior drama illustrates how that story lodged in individual minds even where institutions fell away. He adhered to Manichean teaching for 9 years, and in his Great Confession, he records an interior voice and an inner wrestling that would shape his later theology even as he repudiated his former sect. The memory of those years lived on inside him, the language of light and dark, of inner illumination and culpable shadow, did not evaporate when he turned against the sect publicly. That inward echo is crucial. It shows how doctrines get absorbed into psychological habit. Beliefs become patterns of reflection, and patterns of reflection become tools for new thinkers to repurpose. The nexus is intellectual and symbolic rather than institutional. The formal hierarchy of a religion can be dismantled, its temples closed, its leaders denounced, yet the cognitive framework it offered, dualism as a map of inner conflict, salvific knowledge as a mode of self-examination, can survive in new vocabularies. Think of Jung's archetypes and shadow work, which give mythic shape to inner oppositions, of Freud's explorations of repressed drives and psychic struggle, which recast moral and cosmic conflict in terms of psyche and mechanism, and of modern mythmaking in film, where the forces light and dark mirror ancient dichotomies. None of these are simple continuations of Manichaeism. Instead, they are thematic descendants, convergences of structure and imagery that show how an old framework can be recycled into therapy, theory, and popular culture. Concrete examples make that continuity feel less speculative. Archaeological and manuscript finds in oasis towns and monastic libraries preserved hymns and gnomic teachings that emphasize inner seeing and the liberating retrieval of light. Augustine's introspective rhetoric, originally sharpened in dialogue with Manichean counselors, supplied rhetorical and conceptual muscles that later Christian theologians used in arguing about sin, grace, and self-knowledge. In medieval Europe, accusations of Manichean-like error were hurled at heretical groups whose doctrines valorized the spiritual and denigrated the material. Such polemics testify to the persistence of the dualist imagination even as orthodoxy sought to extinguish it. That is the paradox. Heresy won by losing. The label heretical marked the death of an institution's authority, but it did not always erase its heuristics. Ideas migrated into other discourses, philosophical, psychological, literary, and became invisible scaffolding for new edifices. Modern psychology's foundations, for instance, owe something to a shared concern with interiority, conflict, and healing. Therapeutic practices enlist categories of light and shadow, of knowledge and repression, that are recognizably kin to older salvific vocabularies. Cultural narratives, from novels to blockbuster sagas, import those binaries because they work. They frame human striving in ways that feel intuitively true. Ultimately, the Atlantic to Pacific sweep matters less than the way a mental map traveled. The movement of Manichean themes across linguistic and cultural borders shows how durable explanatory frameworks can be. Institutions crumble, doctrines get prescribed, but images of inner light, of cosmic antagonism, and of a salvific journey have proved adept at finding new hosts. Psychological theory, artistic myth, even secular morality, where they continue to shape how people understand conflict and hope. The religion that was branded a global heresy thus survives paradoxically by becoming a set of tools for thinking, feeling, and storytelling long after its formal structures have vanished. Mani birth 216 CE, Babylon, noble family. In 216 CE, in the swamps and towns that clustered around the great ruin of Babylon, a child entered a world already dense with competing cosmologies. Born to a household that local memory and later sources describe as noble, he arrived with the privileges and burdens that such a standing implied: access to education, to networks of scribes and priests, and to the languages, Aramaic, Persian, and Greek, that flowed like trade winds through Mesopotamia. Family tradition and the surviving fragments of later critics both insist that Mani's upbringing was not that of a nameless peasant. He moved in circles where scriptural debate, ritual literacy, and political patronage intersected. This social station mattered. It furnished the raw materials of a universalist theology and the means to articulate it. His parents, by many accounts affiliated with the Elsasate Christian community, imparted to him an upbringing perched between established churches and marginal prophetic currents. The household was a crucible where Jewish, Christian, Iranian, and indigenous Mesopotamian ideas met. That mixture gave him not only stories but techniques, the habit of scriptural exegesis, the use of visionary rhetoric, and a taste for system building. Small examples survive in later accounts: his capacity to quote sacred passages, his facility with symbolic imagery that point back to formative instruction rather than spontaneous genius. Influence, here, was institutional at first. The institutions were local, but the forms they taught were transportable. Augustine's later recollection of being a member of the Manichaean movement for 9 years becomes an illuminating mirror for what a noble childhood produced. His interior voice, recorded in Confessions, confesses not only a youthful adherence, but the seduction of a coherent cosmology that explained moral dilemmas and psychic torments. Augustine's confession is both personal testimony and a case study. The doctrines that rose from Mani's household and early education could capture and hold the soul of a sensitive mind across years. It is fitting that a boy birthed in Babylon's layered cultural geography should spawn a movement whose appeal could reach Augustine across the Mediterranean. Short sentence. The echo travels, viewed from a global, Atlantic to Pacific perspective, that beginning in Babylon reads like the planting of a seed that would throw roots across continents. The noble household conferred mobility, social, textual, and rhetorical, so that the dualities Mani learned to name could be carried along trade routes and into imperial courts. The paradox is sharp. An origin steeped in privilege and local standing produced ideas that outlived the institutions that first sustained them. This is the heresy won by losing paradox in miniature. Mani's childhood milieu prepared a system precise enough to be recorded, retold, refashioned, and ultimately, for its institutions to fail while its grammar survived. Modern thinkers and storytellers have continued to pluck at the threads begun in that household. When Jung analyzed archetypal polarities, he was tracing patterns that Mani made explicit. Freud's model of psychic conflict resonates with the dualism taught in those early lessons. And even in mythic cinema, where light and dark circle one another, the structure feels familiar. These are not claims of direct transmission so much as recognition of a persistent conceptual grammar, a way of naming inner struggle that was shaped, in part, by a boy raised in Babylon's noble house. It is a striking lineage, brief but true. The practical import of such an origin story is not merely romantic. A noble birth meant access to texts and patrons, which meant ideas could be systematized and projected. Examples are visible in the way later Manichaean missionaries carried coherent catechisms across Persia into Central Asia and beyond. Those campaigns depended on forms of literacy and patronage that a modest upbringing would have struggled to produce. The lesson from modern psychology is plain. The scaffolding of thought often begins in specific social arrangements. Mani's household provided that scaffolding, and the dualistic grammar it shaped became a perennial tool for naming human conflict, therapeutic, theorized, and dramatized from Northwest Africa to East Asia. In the quiet between the lines, the noble cradle reveals an origin story about influence more than pedigree. It explains how a localized formation could seed ideas that travel further than dynasties. And it shows why, centuries later, Augustine's agonized inner voice and the psychoanalytic and mythic languages of modernity still find purchase in the categories born there. Long sentence that rolls onward to meet a short, decisive truth. Institutions perish. Ideas do not. Vision age 12. Divine messenger, the twin appears. Mani's autobiographical fragments and surviving Manichaean hymns describe an early, luminous encounter in which a companion figure, called the syzygos, the twin, appeared to him and delivered a revelation that would anchor an entire symbolic system. The description in the Cologne Mani Codex and later Central Asian manuscripts frames the twin not as an abstract idea, but as a messenger with persona, authoritative, clarifying, and intimate, imparting cosmological maps and ritual signposts that transformed an otherwise solitary adolescent into a claimed bearer of divine knowledge. This apparition was both pedagogue and legitimizer. By attributing his doctrine to a visible, named other, Mani converted personal insight into transmissible doctrine. The mode of address matters. A twin implies equality and reflection, a doubled self authorized to speak on behalf of transcendence. Contrast sharpens when Augustine's experience is brought into the conversation. Augustine later confessed to having been associated with Manichaean circles for 9 years, a period he recounts critically in his Confessions. He also narrates an internal summons in the garden, an inward voice that urged him to read, that became the pivot of his own conversion. Two forms of revelation are therefore present in the late antique imagination: an external, emissarial double who validates doctrine, and an internal voice that validates conscience. Both function as means of negotiating authority, yet they map differently onto communal life. The twin could be cited in public disputation and ritual. The internal voice could not be litigated in the same way. And thus Augustine's retreat from Manichaeism illustrates how authority can shift from persona to psyche without erasing the earlier persona's cultural trace. Seen across an Atlantic to Pacific sweep of cultural memory, the twin appears less as a localized miracle and more as a motif that migrates. Manichaean missionaries carried the claim of a partnering revealer along trade arteries that reached Roman cities, Sogdian caravan towns, and Chinese frontier settlements. Fragments recovered in the Darim Basin or cited in Christian polemics preserve that narrative grain. The image of an exterior double who instructs and legitimizes reverberates in medieval dualist movements and in iconographic echoes across Eurasia. Whether as theological opponent or as diluted folk memory, the twin's logic, that revelation can wear a face, persisted even where institutions fragmented. This is the paradox. The organizational structures failed, yet the imaginative frameworks spread and morphed, surviving as a resource for other minds to borrow. Modern psychology and popular myth-making register similar dynamics, and using them as vantage points clarifies how an early vision can seed later thought. Freud's reflections on the uncanny and the double and Jung's elaboration of archetypes both give analytic language to the experience of encountering a companion within or beyond the self. Jung in particular mapped ancient dualities onto structures of the collective unconscious, making the twin intelligible as an archetypal emissary. Popular narratives do the same. Contemporary epics reuse twin-mentor imagery. Think of the moral mirrorings and dark-light polarity of blockbuster sagas to externalize internal moral debate. Therapists today work with parts of the self and the notion of internalized others in ways that echo the psychological function of Mani's twin: to mediate, to translate, to authorize. The result is a durable lesson about ideas outliving institutions. The very thing deemed heretical becomes a conceptual tool, and the heresy wins by losing the temple but not its story. Prophet age 24. Unite all religions, mission. According to Manichean tradition, the founder received a revelatory summons in early adulthood and soon set forth a program to reconcile the major religious currents then circulating between the Mediterranean and the Far East. He produced a deliberately syncretic scripture and missionary strategy that invoked elements recognizable to Zoroastrians, Christians, Buddhists, and various Gnostic sects, framing himself as a bridge rather than as a mere reformer. His writings, translated into multiple languages and adapted into local idioms, were designed to be portable. Parables for Syriac-speaking congregations, visual catechisms for Central Asian converts, and liturgical hymns for communities along the great trade routes. The self-presentation at this youthful threshold, when he was said to be 24, was less a claim to novelty than an attempt to compose a common grammar of salvation across continents. Across oceans of culture and language, the mission adopted concrete methods. Missionaries were sent along caravan arteries and coastal networks, carrying illustrated codices and ritual objects that encoded the same cosmology in forms intelligible from Alexandria to the oasis towns of the Silk Road and onward toward China. In practice, this meant bilingual sermons, iconographic manuals, and a theology that spoke of light and soul in metaphors familiar to Persian dualists and Hellenistic Christians alike. Archaeological finds, manuscript fragments in Coptic, Middle Persian, and Sogdian scripts, and painted scrolls from Central Asia attest to this Atlantic to Pacific reach and to a conscious strategy of translation, not merely linguistic, but cultural translation, reshaping doctrines so they could be recognized across a plurality of faith worlds. Augustine's 9-year affiliation with the movement provides a vivid, inward counterpoint to the outward mission. His Confessions record an intense interior wrestling that was shaped by Manichaean habits of self-examination and narrative confession. He recounts the lure of an explanatory cosmology and the feeling of an internal voice that both drew him toward and later pushed him away from the sect. He eventually rejected its metaphysics, but the techniques of introspection and the framing of moral struggle in polarized terms left an imprint. Augustine's later work, which helped define Western modes of spiritual autobiography and theological argument, thus carries a paradox. The language of inner conflict and the discipline of confession were polished in part by the very movement he denounced. The larger intellectual afterlife of that youthful, universalizing mission shows how an institutional defeat can amplify influence rather than erase it. Jungian analysts later found in Manichean dualism resonant symbols for the individuation process and the integration of shadow contents. Freud's conception of psychic antagonisms, while arising from different clinical concerns, echoes the sense of conflict between competing interior realms. Popular mythmaking follows the same binary grammar. Modern epics, such as the Star Wars saga, recycle the light versus dark motif in ways that feel ancestral. In this sense, the framework outlived its ecclesiastical structures. Ideas seeded by a missionary ambition to unite persisted as cognitive tools for understanding the self and history. The paradox is clear. Labeled a heresy by winning institutions, the movement's conceptual payload dispersed into psychology, literature, and collective imagination. Heretic in form, foundational in consequence. The ultimate irony is that the attempt to unify religions, launched at a precise youthful turn of destiny, matured not into a single enduring church, but into a set of motifs and methods that undergirded later systems of thought. By losing the battle for institutional permanence, it made its categories available to other traditions and disciplines. Confessional practices, polarized moral narratives, and cosmologies of inner liberation were repurposed, sometimes explicitly, sometimes by osmosis, into frameworks that shaped modern introspective culture and the psychological sciences. The mission that began as an outward campaign to reconcile creeds thus became an inward grammar for how individuals reconcile opposing forces within themselves. The unity envisioned at 24 migrated from synod halls to the architecture of the psyche, spanning Atlantic minds to Pacific shores. Doctrine: light versus darkness, cosmic eternal principles. Manichaean thought centers on a metaphysical bifurcation. two eternal, irreconcilable principles that govern existence. Light, the realm of spirit, cognition, and order. Darkness, the realm of matter, passion, and chaos. The light is not merely a moral category but a substantive, luminous essence dispersed through the cosmos. The dark is dense, cohesive, and swallowing. In practical terms, this doctrine explains suffering and corruption as the result of trapped light particles enmeshed in a material world, and it prescribes knowledge, purity, and ritual discipline as the means by which those sparks are released back into their luminous source. The religion organized communities around this cosmology, distinguishing ascetic elect who worked directly to liberate the light from those who supported them, and it framed ethical life as participation in a cosmic recovery rather than merely obedience to a social code. Augustine's own inward account gives this dualism an unmistakably human timbre. He confesses that he lived within Manichean explanations for 9 years, and his writing preserves the voice of someone alternately seduced by the system's clarity and tormented by its consequences. He admired the intellectual rigor of a universe parsed into opposites, yet he felt the inward violence of being taught that parts of the world, or parts of himself, belonged irrevocably to darkness. His internal debate reads like an early psychoanalytic case study. Attraction to a unifying cosmology, guilt and doubt over moral absolutes, the search for a reconciliatory narrative that could hold complexity without fragmentation. That confession functions as both personal testimony and philosophical probe into what it means to live inside a world split into enemies. When institutions closed the bookstores and silenced lamplit gatherings, the dualistic grammar did not die. It migrated. Across the Atlantic to Pacific expanse, the light versus dark imagery supplied a framework for other thinkers and storytellers to retell the human predicament. Carl Jung drew on a deep well of Gnostic and dualistic symbols, archetypes of shadow and self that mirror the Manichean configuration, and built a therapeutic practice that seeks integration rather than cosmological exile. Sigmund Freud's articulation of internal conflict, ambivalence, and repression bears a formal affinity to the idea that inner forces oppose one another. Even modern myth-making in cinema and literature adopts the binary as a dramatic engine, the luminous ideal opposed to a seductive abyss. Think of familiar scenes where a single choice tips a fate from brightness into darkness. The gesture is ancient, but the cadence is continuous from Persia to China to Western shores. This is the paradox of a defeated religion becoming a seedbed for later thought. Heresy won by losing. Cut off from institutional patronage, the doctrine's stark metaphors became portable and adaptable, easier to graft onto dreams, therapies, and popular myth than an empire or an ecclesiastical hierarchy. Modern psychology, in particular, inherits a shadow of Manichaean insight while transforming its ontology. Where Manichaeism located evil in an external, substantial darkness to be escaped, later thinkers recast those conflicts as intrapsychic tensions to be acknowledged and integrated. Techniques that inquire into conscience, repression, and the fragmented self echo the older narrative but turn a cosmic battle into a clinical project. Liberation remains the goal, but the battlefield is interior. The Atlantic to Pacific spread of these motifs produced specific cultural syntheses. In some places, dualism was reframed in Buddhist idiom. Elsewhere, it was absorbed into Christian moral cosmologies. Still in other quarters, it resurfaced as existential drama on stage and screen. The result is an intellectual lineage that is less about direct descent and more about recurring structural questions. What is the origin of evil? How does light return to its source? Asked in ever-changing languages. Ideas outlive institutions. A doctrine that presented the world as a theater of light struggling against an ever-encroaching darkness survives in therapeutic models, in mythic storytelling, and in the collective vocabulary of conflict. The outcome is strangely triumphant. Having been branded heretical, the doctrine's binary lens spread farther than any single church could have carried it, shaping the ways modern thought frames inner opposition and the long human enterprise of reconciliation. Particles trapped, light imprisoned in matter. Manichaean communities left manuscripts in Coptic, Middle Persian, Sogdian, and Chinese along the Silk Road, and those texts make explicit a cosmology built around the idea that shards of divine light are embedded within the material cosmos. The world, in this view, is not simply a stage for human drama but a battleground where particles of luminous being have been ensnared inside matter, in dust and stone, in plants and animals, and most poignantly, in human flesh. Priests and lay adherents were instructed in ritual modes and ascetic practices designed to loosen those sparks. Fasting, careful eating, ritual purification, and liturgical recitation all functioned as technologies of extraction, intended to coax the liberated light back toward its transcendent source. Manichaean scriptures and archaeological finds give concrete texture to this abstract theology. Coptic hymns sing of sparks and letters of light hidden in the body. Sogdian fragments preserve moral exegeses explaining how ethical discipline facilitates release. Chinese translations frame the struggle with metaphors familiar to East Asian readers, likening trapped light to pearls concealed in muddy water. These are not mere metaphors for sin. They operate as a cosmological physics, a claim about the constitution of reality that prescribes precise human responses. The elect, who renounced worldly consumption, were the technicians of liberation. The hearers supported them and participated in sacramental acts that redistributed spiritual energy. The practical implication is simple and exact. Certain human acts diminish material bondage and increase the flight of light. First, remember the conviction as if it were a pulse. For 9 years, First lived under the doctrine that each stubborn desire was a wall around a luminous particle, and that my own pleasures were both prison and prison keeper. That internal voice, tentative, bright, relentlessly persuasive, narrated every meal and every intimacy as an opportunity for either further imprisonment or gentle emancipation. My confession was not only about belief, but about a felt architecture of the soul. Light wanted return. First possessed the means, imperfectly applied, to help it go. The memory of that lived theology explains why the language of sparks and release lodged so deeply in later Christian polemics and spiritual introspection. It is why a former adherent's testimony could become a vector for a rival tradition's self-understanding. Across centuries and continents, the image of imprisoned radiance did not die with institutions. It mutated into psychological metaphors and narrative archetypes. Jungian analysis encountered the same polarity, a luminous self shadowed by the unconscious, and treated the individuation process as a progressive liberation of inner light from the claustrophobic forms of ego and repression. Freud's model of repressed drives, while different in vocabulary, likewise conceptualizes psychic energy confined and needing transformation. Even popular myth-making echoes the pattern. The struggle between light and dark in modern epics resonates with Manichaean tonalities without requiring direct lineage. What survives is a structural imagination, a conviction that inner brightness can be obstructed by material or psychic impediments, and that disciplined work of various kinds affects release. This survival suggests a paradox. The heresy that was defeated as an institution nevertheless won by losing. Its specific churches and canonical authorities faded, yet its ontology and techniques endured as frameworks for interpreting human suffering and salvation. Manuscripts recovered from oases and monasteries, from the Mediterranean margins to Central Asian caravansaries to Chinese libraries, supplied raw material for scholars, poets, and therapists who would not call themselves Manichaean, but who unconsciously used its grammar. Today, therapists who speak of recovering the authentic self, artists who dramatize trapped potential, and filmmakers who stage cosmic dualisms participate in a distributed inheritance. The modern psychological foundation angle is not a claim of direct descent, but of thematic kinship. What Manichaeism formulated as cosmological physics, psychology reframes as the dynamics of consciousness. In both registers, the remedy is knowledge enacted, ritualized attention, disciplined practice, and a communal economy of care that makes escape possible for what was once thought imprisoned. Salvation through knowledge, gnosis, liberation. Mani presented a cosmos in which luminous particles were entangled in matter, and release was not accomplished by ritual alone, but by an inner illumination that could be known and lived. His system set knowledge, gnosis, at the center, knowing the origin and destiny of light, recognizing the traps of the material, and practicing a disciplined way of life to unbind the spark within. This was not abstract theology. It translated into a clear social architecture. Communities divided into the ascetic elect, who embraced celibacy, strict fasting, and ritual purity to conserve and liberate light, and the lay hearers, who supported them materially while aspiring toward deeper insight. Texts attributed to Mani, including the Shiburigan and collections known as Kephalaya, offered layered exegesis that mixed cosmology, allegory, and practical instruction, maps for inner navigation rather than mere dogma. The knowledge Manichaeism prized was experiential and diagnostic rather than propositional. Followers were taught to read the world as a text of trapped light. The body, the appetites, even the social order could be decoded and reframed as material obstacles to liberation. Practices combined ascetic discipline with symbolic reading. Meals, silence, and ritual gestures became exercises in attention meant to sharpen perception of the luminous element within. Augustine's long personal encounter with Manichean teaching is a revealing example. He spent 9 formative years attached to the sect and later recorded the persistent inner voice that accompanied his doubts and attractions. He described being drawn by their promise of rational explanations and secret knowledge, and yet tormented by a voice that pressed him toward questions they could not satisfactorily answer. That inward disputation, confessionally rendered, shows the gnosis at work, salvation as a process of internal clarification, not just external assent. Beyond institutional survival, the Manichean framework migrated into other intellectual and cultural soil where it metamorphosed. Carl Jung, for instance, explicitly engaged with Gnostic and Manichean imagery, treating myths of light and darkness as psychic structures essential to individuation. His emphasis on retrieving lost or repressed aspects of the psyche echoes the Manichean project of liberating light through insight. Sigmund Freud's models of competing drives and inner conflict, while arising from different methods, resonate with the same structural intuition that human life involves opposing forces that must be understood rather than simply legislated against. Even popular myth-making has absorbed the pattern. The stark light versus dark archetype in modern epics like Star Wars refracts ancient Manichean binaries into cinematic morality plays. The paradox is striking. The institutional label faded, and yet the pattern survived, a heresy that, by enduring in altered form, could be said to have won by losing. That paradox has practical consequences for contemporary thought and practice. Cognitive and depth psychological therapies, for example, operationalize the idea that bringing hidden material into awareness can affect transformation. Patients are asked to recognize and reframe impulses that once seemed simply destructive, thereby recovering parts of themselves that are dangerous only when unconscious. Similarly, modern spiritual movements borrow the Manichean emphasis on discernment and inner knowledge. Contemplative attention, symbolic interpretation, and moral disciplines are proposed as means to free one's attention from the gravity of material distraction. The broader lesson is philosophical as much as practical. Ideas about salvation through knowledge can outlive the bureaucracies that once held them, seeding disciplines as diverse as psychotherapy, mystical practice, and storytelling. Short defeats in institutional terms do not preclude long victories in the realm of concepts. Ultimately, the Manichean insistence that liberation is an epistemic and existential achievement reframes salvation as a cognitive task. Knowledge becomes an active cultivation, a sequence of clarifications, practices, and moral reorientations that progressively disembed light from matter. The image endures, light struggling outward, darkness resisting, and human beings positioned as both battlefield and liberators. Such images have crossed oceans and centuries, moving from Persian streets to Chinese courts, from North African debates to contemporary clinics and cinemas, proving the central claim that ideas, especially those that map inner realities, tend to outlive the institutions that first articulated them. Ascetic practice, elect strict, hearers lay followers. Across a wide arc of human geography, from Mediterranean ports and Atlantic-facing coasts to inland caravan cities and beyond toward Pacific horizons, the movement organized its followers into 2 complementary orders that structured daily life, ritual, and ethics. The elect lived as a disciplined elite within the community, committing to strict ascetic practices that aimed to enact the religion's cosmic dualism in personal conduct. The hearers remained lay adherents who retained family life and occupations, yet carried heavy moral and practical obligations. They provided food, shelter, and logistical support to sustain the elect, and in doing so participated in salvation through service. The elect's regimen was austere and deeply symbolic. They embraced celibacy, rigorous fasting, meticulous truthfulness, and the renunciation of violence as practical expressions of cosmic allegiance. Abstaining from meat and killing was not merely dietary but cosmological, because taking life was construed as aiding the realm of darkness. Daily life for an elect member was organized around prayer, silence, study, and careful ritual observance, gestures intended to detach the soul from material entanglement and to liberate trapped particles of light. The hearers practiced a moderated version of these ideals. Marriage, work, and engagement with ordinary commerce were permitted, but accompanied by recurring acts of charity toward the elect and by moral expectations that marked them as morally invested allies rather than casual sympathizers. The relationship was reciprocal and paradoxical. Elect depended on hearers for the material basics they could not handle themselves: food, clothing, shelter, because the elect forbore from violence, economic aggression, and, in many communities, handling money. Hearers depended on elect for spiritual guidance, ritual legitimacy, and a concentrated exemplification of the faith's metaphysical claims. This division produced a living tension. Holiness enacted in a cloister of renunciation was sustained by a worldly network of caregivers and families who carried the burden of daily survival. It turned communal life into a moral economy in which ascetic purity and pragmatic support coexisted as two faces of the same salvific project. Personal testimonies make that tension vivid. Augustine's confession of a 9-year involvement with the sect captures the interior contest between intellectual attraction to its dual explanations and the pull of everyday life and voice. He described an interior voice and a moral tug that registered both the allure of uncompromising discipline and the disquiet of conscience. His years as a hearer bore witness to the complicated seduction of ascetic clarity even as it left him restless. His account becomes, in effect, a microcosm: the hearer's longing, the elect's exaltation, and the inner voice that ultimately interrogates both. The longer cultural life of those practices matters far beyond institutional survival. The binary logic that ascetic elect and pragmatic hearers dramatized, a sharp moral split between purity and compromise, reappears in later symbolic and psychological vocabularies. Jung and other thinkers excavated Gnostic and dualistic imagery to probe the psyche's divisions. The idea that inner conflict can be mapped as light versus dark helped shape archetypal analysis. Freudian and post-Freudian frameworks reframed ascetic impulses and the denial of desire as psychological defenses, suggesting that what looked like spiritual discipline might also organize unconscious economies. Cultural works, from mythic epics to modern film, recycle the same structure: a luminous, renouncing ideal opposed by a worldly, sustaining praxis. Even a modern saga of the light and dark embodies the same existential architecture, an echo rather than a direct lineage of that ancient moral partition. That echo yields a paradox scholars sometimes call heresy won by losing. Institutional collapse did not erase the pattern. It scattered into philosophy, pastoral practice, and the language of psychology. The elect's strictness and the hearer's indispensable support became templates for later communities that balanced radical ideals with pragmatic accommodation. Ideas outlive institutions. The brittle shells dissolved, while the framework, the epistemic split between salvation through renunciation and salvation through support, migrated into secular categories, therapeutic models of splitting, literary archetypes of purity versus complicity, and even popular mythic language that frames moral life as an intergenerational relay between those who renounce and those who sustain. Viewed from a contemporary vantage, the ascetic division offers both practical lessons and conceptual tools. Clinicians see in the pattern a proto-language for concepts like splitting and projection. Philosophers find in it a precise dramatization of ethical trade-offs. cultural critics find a recurrent motif across oceans and eras. The elect and the hearers together form a living thought experiment about how communities balance transcendence and immanence, how ideals can be maintained only by those who remain engaged in ordinary labor, and how the soul's purification is always socially embedded. In that way, the ascetic practice lives on, not as a fossilized ordinance, but as a structural way of seeing human conflict, devotion, and dependence that continues to inform psychology, storytelling, and moral imagination from Atlantic margins to Pacific horizons. Global spread begins: Persia, Mesopotamia, India. From the Persian heartland, the creed moved outward like a philosophy that refused to stay put, taking root in cities where imperial roads met caravan tracks. Mani composed the Ars Hang, an illustrated handbook that could be rendered into Middle Persian and Parthian and carried across marketplaces. His language of light and darkness proved portable because it spoke to familiar religious vocabularies: Zoroastrian cosmic struggle, Christian salvation imagery, Buddhist renunciation, all reframed into a single, missionary grammar. Manuscripts in Middle Persian and Parthian attest to a literate center of circulation, while visual programs and codified hymns made doctrinal ideas easy to translate into the iconographies of other peoples. Missionaries moved not merely as preachers, but as cultural translators, rephrasing dualist metaphors to fit local categories, so the core cosmological drama could be understood from Nile to Oxus. Mesopotamia became a crucial hinge where Syriac-speaking Christians and Iranian clerical traditions encountered these teachings head-on. Syriac translations and polemical tracts record heated exchanges. Bilingual communities preserved Manichaean hymns in scripts and languages that allowed the movement to lodge within existing networks of trade and religion. The Cologne Mani Codex and other Syriac testimonies preserve a voice of confrontation and dialogue, and those records show how Manichaeism could be both intelligible and irksome to neighboring faiths. Its clerical organization, an ascetic elect, and a network of lay adherents mirrored structures familiar to Christians and Zoroastrians alike, enabling adherents to coexist and compete within the same urban fabric even when authorities branded them heretical. Farther east, the same missionary imperative met the languages and metaphors of the subcontinent. In the borderlands of Gandhara and along the Silk Roads, Manichaean teachers adopted Buddhist terms and soteriological frames so that the struggle between light and dark could be heard in a Prakrit cadence. Archaeological traces, manuscript fragments, iconographic parallels, and references in local religious literature show that the faith did not transplant intact, but hybridized, picking up imagery and ritual techniques that made its universal claim intelligible to Indian audiences. That adaptability was not a dilution so much as a method. Doctrines refracted through local lenses, producing syncretic forms that left faint but detectable traces in art and devotional practice across the Indo-Aryan cultural sphere. Augustine's Confession of a 9-Year Allegiance, with its intimate record of inward debate, gives the East to West movement a startlingly personal echo. His account preserves Manichaean syllables even as he repudiates them, and his description of an interior disputant, an internal voice, wrestling with desire and truth, becomes part of a longer Western habit of inward scrutiny. That habit fed later explorations of psyche and symbol. The nexus is visible. Jung and other thinkers mine Gnostic and dualistic motifs to articulate archetypes and conflicts of the unconscious. Freud's emphasis on intrapsychic struggle resonates with the Manichaean map of inner light and shadow, and popular myths, from epic space operas to noir dramas, reuse the binary dramaturgy of cosmic combat. Thus the paradox, declared heresy, institutionally crushed in many lands, yet conceptually triumphant because the template it offered, an elegant framework for framing moral and psychic conflict, continued to be repurposed. Ideas outlived institutions. The heresy won by losing is not mere flourish but an observable pattern. Ritual and organizational structures may vanish, but a compelling symbolic grammar seeps into adjacent systems: liturgies, confessions, literary tropes, psychological theories, where it mutates and persists. Manichaeism's global sweep across Persian courts, Mesopotamian metropolises, and the Indian cultural horizon shows how a missionary creed becomes a reservoir of images and analytic distinctions that later minds, from theologians to therapists to storytellers, draw upon when they seek to describe the human condition. The faith's institutional death did not signal an end to its conceptual life. Instead, its dualities furnished later centuries with tools for interpreting conscience, conflict, and the drama of choice across an Atlantic to Pacific array of cultures. Rome adoption, Augustine Manichaean 9 years, 1928. First devoted 9 years of my life to the Manichaean communion, a stretch that began in my late teens and carried me into my late 20s, and first recall it not as a simple faith, but as a disciplined grammar for dividing the world. The sect taught a cosmology of light and dark that answered the anxious questions of a young rhetorician who wanted both moral clarity and intellectual rigor. First listened to their scriptures, learned their debates, and accepted their moral disciplines. Yet the acceptance was never without an internal counterpoint, a perpetual interrogation of doctrine that first rehearsed aloud and in silence. First met Faustus of Mileve and other teachers whose person and argument left marks on me. Faustus was courteous but limited in the ways first yearned. His learned modesty could not satisfy the rhetorical hunger for systematic proof. The encounter changed me less by conversion than by critique. Hearing their limits forced my thought inward. First kept their texts like lanterns, sometimes steady, sometimes flickering, and first would return to them in private, as if testing a bridge that might carry me somewhere else. My confession, when first finally wrote it, preserves that internal noise, the dialectic of desire and disgust, attraction and rejection. Inward dialogue became my laboratory. Manichaeism taught me to hear binaries as structures, and those structures later turned up in places no one could have expected. Jung, with his interest in shadow and archetype, found echoes of such split images in the psyche. Freud, though framing conflict in different terms, worked with divisions of forces inside a person. The Manichean map of inner battle did not survive as an ecclesiastical empire, yet its cartography of moral polarity fed a continuing human attempt to narrate conflict within. There is a paradox here. A heresy that loses its institutional ground can win the long cultural game by becoming a way to think. My years among the Manichaeans were a repository of phrases, images, and modes of thinking that outlived the community itself. Later storytellers, philosophers, and psychologists drew on those motifs, sometimes directly, often indirectly, because dualism offers a compelling shorthand for inner struggle. Even modern myth-making, across oceans and centuries, borrows the binary dramaturgy, a luminous ideal opposed by a consuming shadow. The form persists. The institution perishes. First confess that those 9 years taught me the technique of inner conversation more than they taught me an immutable truth. First learned to argue with myself, to place competing wills side by side, and to trace the consequences of allegiance. That method, this crucible of self-reflection, became a seed for modern introspection. It is why the Manichaean episode in my life reads differently in later eras, not merely as an error corrected, but as an incubator of a style of thought that finds new houses in psychology, literature, and myth. In the end, the strangest victory of what was called heresy lies in its literature of doubt. My confession preserves the motions, the oscillations between assent and revolt, the rhetorical strategies used to sustain belief, and the admissions that dismantle it. Those pages have been mined by thinkers across continents who seek to understand moral division, unconscious motive, and narrative resolution. Thus, the faith that failed to monopolize hearts nonetheless taught a method of inner adjudication that traveled with the human voice from the Mediterranean to the minds that shape our Atlantic to Pacific imaginaries today. Silk Road expansion, Central Asia, Xinjiang, China. Across the caravan arteries that tied the Iranian plateau to the eastern deserts, merchants, diplomats, and ascetics carried more than silk and silver. They carried a cosmology that refracted into many tongues and scripts. Sogdian traders moving through oasis towns acted as mobile congregations, transcribing Manichaean hymns into Sogdian and Parthian, copying illuminated leaflets on paper and parchment that would later be excavated from the Turfan Basin and the Dunhuang Caves. In the oasis states of Central Asia, the faith found translational power. Persian cosmology was given Sogdian cadence and later Turkic shape, while Chinese clerks rendered Mani's paradoxes into characters that would astonish Confucian scholars and bewilder Buddhist monks. Trade routes were not only economic conduits, they were axial lines of thought, and in every caravanserai a debate might begin anew. The Uyghur courts of the northern steppe elevated Manichaeism from merchant creed to court religion, commissioning translations into Old Turkic, and in doing so they sewed the doctrine into imperial ritual and textile design. Evidence of this cultural patronage survives in fragments of manuscripts, ritual objects, and iconography unearthed from sites around Xinjiang. Painted leaves show a syncretic iconography where Christian light, Zoroastrian fire, and Buddhist lotus motifs cohabit the same frame. The art was not mere ornament. It encoded a soteriology suited to a world of caravans, salvation as liberation of scattered light, ritual as a map for reassembling shards of soul across continents. These artifacts prove not just presence, but adaptation, a faith reshaping itself to fit new languages, new politics, new skies. Augustine's inner testimony, the 9-year confession of a youthful allegiance and eventual renunciation, resonates here like an interior caravan bell. First held their words against my chest, he might have said. First learned to read darkness as a thing to be named. That internal voice, conflicted, searching, sometimes triumphant, becomes emblematic of how Manichean dualism lodged itself in other minds far from its birthplace. The confession's introspective turn helped seed a Western habit of inner accounting that later philosophers and clinicians would cultivate. In Central Asia and Xinjiang, the same inward drama played out publicly. Lay believers negotiated identity under competing empires. Monks translated metaphors of light into therapeutic ritual that felt like psychotherapy before the word existed. The intellectual afterlife of those translations is striking when viewed through modern lenses. Jung's archetypes echo Manichean binaries. The struggle between light and dark appears in Jungian individuation as a symbolic drama of integration. Freud's model of buried impulses and conscious repression finds uncanny parallels in Mani's doctrine of trapped light and the material world's imprisoning weight. Even popular myth-making, the binary struggle of Star Wars light and dark, can be read as a cultural descendant of the same narrative grammar that Manichaeism refined along the Silk Road. Ideas outlived institutions, and by losing political dominance the movement dispersed its conceptual DNA into other systems of thought. Heresy, in that sense, won by losing. Expelled from grand temples, its metaphors entered private practice and academic discourse alike. What remained in Xinjiang was more than relics. It was a methodological legacy, the practice of translation, syncretism, and psychological vocabulary that would underpin later forms of religious and secular thought. Local communities kept liturgical melodies and ritual formulas alive. Manuscript fragments, show hymn structures, and confessional modes that resemble therapeutic dialogues. The Silk Road thus functioned as a neural pathway for an idea, a schema of dual conflict that could be reattached to different organs of society, from court cult to folk ritual to the introspective essays of Western thinkers. Across the Atlantic to Pacific sweep of influence, the Manichean nucleus diffused, recombined, and persisted in the human psyche long after its formal institutions had faded. Tang China recognition, 694 CE officially accepted. In the imperial court of the Tang, an imperial edict in 694 CE formally recognized the foreign teaching that Chinese literati called Mingjiao, the religion of light. Merchants and missionaries who crossed the oceans and deserts, Sogdians and other Silk Road travelers, brought scrolls and hymns that were translated into Chinese idiom, and the court's acceptance opened corridors for ritual practice, temple space, and the slow grafting of dualistic theology onto local cosmologies. Manuscripts later sealed in the dunes at Dunhuang and the oasis libraries at Turfan record liturgies and didactic poems composed in Chinese script, evidence that doctrinal forms adapted quickly. Buddhist terminology became a vehicle for Mani's cosmology, Taoist vocabulary carried its metaphysics, and Confucian administrative vocabulary framed its social life. This was not mere tolerance. It was a legal recognition that allowed Manichaean communities to root themselves in the Middle Kingdom, to sing their cosmology in a tonal language far from its Mesopotamian birthplace. Augustine's inner recollection provides a mirror across continents. He would later confess that for 9 years he belonged to that sect, listening, arguing, and learning from a dual world picture that made moral life a contest of luminous and shadowy powers. In him, that internal voice became a philosophical problem as much as a religious apology. He felt the pull of light and the seduction of darkness, and he wrestled. He writes of attachment and critique in one breath. The confession is both indictment and intimacy, a small personal archive of what happens when an idea lingers inside a mind long enough to reshape memory. The tone is intimate. The content is transcontinental. The paradox is plain and paradoxical. Doctrine lost its institutional throne, but kept its kingdom inside thought. Modern psychology bears this legacy. Jung's archetypes and his dialectic of ego and shadow resurrect the Manichean axis under a new name. Freud's notion of conflicting drives reframes the same tug-of-war as psychic economy rather than cosmic warfare. The nexus is conceptual rather than genealogical. No direct institutional continuity is necessary for an idea to persist. Even a cultural phenomenon like Star Wars channels the same mythic grammar, a cosmos split into light and dark, redemption and fall, a force that binds and a force that corrupts. These cultural and clinical descendants show how an apparently defeated heresy can win by dispersal. Its schema infiltrates dreams, myths, and therapy rooms long after temples vanish. Concrete examples underline the point. Dunhuang scrolls preserved hymns that would have been sung in Chinese temples. Those hymns echo in later folk sectarian language and in the vocabulary of repentance and illumination found across East Asian devotional movements. In Europe, Augustine's ambivalence about his Manichaean years helped shape Christian polemics that, in turn, refined how Westerners thought about sin, will, and interior conflict. Psychologists and mythologists later harvested similar categories, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, without ever invoking a Manichaean priest. Thus, the faith's institutional death did not end its usefulness as a map for human experience. Ideas outlived their churches, and in doing so they became tools for self-understanding, narrative storytelling, and psychological theory. A heresy that paid the cost of survival by dissolving into the languages of new disciplines and popular imagination. Geographic peak, Spain to China, 8th century. Across an immense web of caravan roads and coastal crossings, one faith established a living corridor from the Atlantic shores of Iberia to the oases of the Darime Basin and into the imperial capitals of East Asia. Traders, translators, and migrant communities carried Mani's dualistic cosmology along the Sogdian trade networks. Sogdian merchants wrote and copied Manichaean hymns in their own script and in Middle Persian, and those texts rode the Silk Road into Chinese-speaking enclaves where they were rendered into Chinese and Uyghur. In Central Asia, archaeological discoveries, manuscripts dug from the sands of Turfan and Dunhuang, attest not only to the religion's doctrinal vocabulary, but to its liturgical life in languages as diverse as Sogdian, Parthian, Syriac, and Chinese. The textual fragments show ritual manuals, hymns, and pictorial diagrams that reveal how a single cosmological story was refracted into dozens of cultural dialects. In the West, the story looked different, but no less vivid. Iberian and North African Christians encountered Manichaean thinkers as both rivals and interlocutors. Polemical works survive that quote Manichaean authorities and try to dismantle their cosmology, and several Spanish movements were accused by contemporary bishops of harboring Manichaean tendencies or derivatives of its dualism. Augustine's Confessions records an interior drama from his youthful years. He later described a prolonged, 9-year involvement with Manichaean teachers and an inner voice that measured his moral perplexity against the religion's stark division of light and darkness. That confession is itself revealing. The text is at once a refutation and a testimony, carrying the very language of Manichaean inwardness into Christian autobiography. Short sentence. It is a paradox, to be defeated institutionally, and yet to serve as a crucible for a rival theology's grammatical and psychological categories. The epical map from Spain to China is not merely cartography, but philosophy in motion. Ideas moved faster than armies. In the Eastern courts, the religion became an official creed for some Turkic elites, folded into imperial ritual and art, and thus re-entered Eurasian political consciousness with new force. Manichaean iconography, light against dark, luminous savior figures, and complex cosmological diagrams, left an imprint on religious art across the corridor. Visual motifs survived even as formal communities dwindled. Long sentence here that expands on how liturgical phrases and symbolic oppositions permeated other traditions, from syncretic Buddhist Manichaean imagery in Western China to Christian polemics in the Mediterranean that preserved, in hostile quotation, the terms of the Manichaean debate. This is where the philosophical resonance becomes modern. The dualistic schema, an intrapsychic battlefield between opposing principles, echoes and frameworks that would resurface centuries later in very different disciplines. Jung's engagement with Gnostic and dualistic mythologies finds a sympathetic chord with Manichaean motifs. Freud's model of internal conflict and latent drives, while emerging from a different toolkit, parallels the notion that human experience is structured by competing, often concealed forces. Popular culture participates too. The cosmic struggle of light and dark in modern mythmaking, obvious in global phenomena like Star Wars, functions as a narrative heir to the Manichaean imagination. The institution fell, yet its grammar of inner conflict survived and migrated into tools of interpretation and imagination. Ideas outlive institutions. Short, emphatic sentence. The broader paradox is that the label heresy itself helped carry the thought forward. Persecuted and condemned forms of Manichaean belief were described at length by their opponents, and those very descriptions became primary sources for later scholars, mystics, and therapists who mined ancient cosmologies for meaning. Cathar dualism in medieval Western Europe, Renaissance interest in Hermetic and Gnostic texts, and even some currents of modern psychotherapy can be read as distant relatives or resonant echoes, shared ways of modeling human splitness and moral anguish. A heresy won by losing. It is a paradox that challenges how we measure victory in religion. Institutional demise is not the same as conceptual extinction. From the Atlantic littoral to the Pacific Rim, the Manichaean arc demonstrates a larger human tendency, the migration of frameworks that explain interior life and cosmic order. Concrete examples, from Turfan manuscript fragments and Sogdian hymnals to Augustine's own autobiographical reckoning, show how a defeated sect transmitted images, phrases, and diagnostic metaphors into the vocabulary of later thinkers. The global sweep of that transmission suggests that religions function not only as communal structures, but as repositories of symbolic technology. When institutions collapse, their symbolic tools are redistributed, repurposed, and sometimes reconstituted in disciplines as remote as psychotherapy or as popular as space opera. Short sentence to close. Mani's execution 276 CE, skin stuffed, body displayed. Arrested by Sasanian officials and removed from the public movement he had forged, Mani died in custody. In contemporary and later Syriac, Greek and Arabic chroniclers record a final insult meant to obliterate both man and message. His skin was flayed, stuffed, and exhibited as a grotesque token of triumph at the imperial precinct. The spectacle was not merely punitive. It was performative statecraft, an attempt to convert a living founder into a cautionary relic, a sealed end to the charismatic authority that had radiated from the Persian court westward into Roman cities and eastward along the Silk Road. The act of stuffing and displaying the skin turned bodily mortality into a public fable, visible to traders, soldiers, and scribes whose routes spanned an Atlantic to Pacific sweep. The image endures because it worked on two registers at once. On the surface, it was deterrence, a macabre billboard intended to frighten potential adherents. On another level, it was symbolic theater, a suture of violence meant to sever the narrative power of the prophet. Yet such terror can have the opposite effect. Where the flesh is paraded and the name nailed to a gate, a story is amplified rather than erased. Merchants carried tales along caravan tracks. Refugees and prisoners whispered them in port cities. Clerks copied polemics in scriptoria. The state's aim to annihilate lineage merely embalmed the memory, and the memory flowed into foreign tongues and traditions. Augustine's later account of his own 9-year adherence to Manichaeism becomes a striking internal echo of that public drama. He records, in the tone of an inward tribunal, how Manichean cosmology lodged within his psyche and then receded under the pressure of other convictions. His internal voice narrates struggle rather than capitulation. Augustine transformed the external spectacle of suppression into an interiorized case study. The teacher killed, the doctrine surviving in the hearts of converts. That inward persistence is part of the paradox. Heresy won by losing, because defeat in the public square often fertilizes private conviction. Personal confession, after all, preserves ideas in ways that public punishment cannot anticipate. From that preserved interiority, the broader, long-term afterlife of Mani's framework can be traced not as a tidy institutional lineage, but as a network of motifs and cognitive templates. The binary cosmology of light and darkness, spirit and matter, reappears in later dualistic sects, in medieval polemics, and as a resonant mythic rhythm for thinkers probing the split between conscious life and subterranean drives. Jung read the symbols of ancient dualisms as archetypal currents. Freud mapped psychic conflict into a scientific idiom. Popular mythmakers have distilled similar oppositions into modern epics, Star Wars being one cultural instance where light and shadow organize narrative identity. None of these are direct descendants in an organizational sense, and yet they inherit a way of thinking about internal struggle that Mani articulated, an imaginative architecture for explaining why people feel torn, guilty, or called. Viewed through this lens, the stuffed skin on a royal post is grimly emblematic of a larger dynamic in intellectual history. The physical destruction of a prophet did not so much end a system as converted into a cultural skeleton, a set of concepts that could be picked over, reassembled, and reanimated in new vocabularies. Psychologists, theologians, and storytellers have repeatedly tapped that reservoir of binary imagery to frame inner conflict and moral choice. In that way, the execution and its theatrical aftermath illuminate how ideas can outlive their institutions. Institutions crumble under force, while narratives and psychological structures, once embedded inside people and across cultures from the Mediterranean harbors to the Chinese frontiers, continue to shape thought and myth long after the state's victory has been posted for public view. Suppression intensifies. Christianity wins Rome, heresy declared. When Christianity consolidated its hold on the Roman state, it did more than change liturgy. It changed the legal and cultural landscape that had allowed religions like Manichaeism to compete openly. Imperial and ecclesiastical authorities moved to criminalize and marginalize dualist teachings. Proselytizing was curtailed, communities were expelled or absorbed, and clerical networks were pressured into silence. Church councils and influential bishops framed Mani's synthesis of Zoroastrian, Christian, and Gnostic motifs as doctrinally dangerous, and the vocabulary of heresy became a tool of governance as much as theology. Texts were seized, followers dispersed, and whole social spaces once hospitable to Manichean missionaries were reconfigured around orthodox rites and imperial patronage. In North Africa, the intellectual contest took a personal shape. Augustine, who later wrote his Confessions and complex theological treatises, spent a span of years affiliated with Manichean teachers, then turned against them in a rigorous public refutation. He recorded, in the Register of Inward Speech, a long interior struggle, the seduction of a coherent dualist cosmology, the moral pressures that kept him bound, the gradual unraveling of certainty as his mind encountered alternative explanations. That internal voice, reluctant, analytical, ashamed, and searching, became the medium through which an institutional victory was narrated. Augustine did not merely displace a rival creed. He recontextualized its claims, absorbing and then refuting them in ways that would harden orthodoxy and delegitimize organized Manichean practice in the Western Empire. Suppression did not always proceed by straightforward violence alone. Legal prohibitions and ecclesiastical censure worked with intellectual critique to collapse networks. Missionary routes along the Mediterranean and across the Silk routes were constricted, while monastic institutions and episcopal courts offered new centers of authority. Yet the more institutions sought to eradicate the movement, the more its basic polarities, light versus darkness, spirit versus matter, inner knowledge versus external law, got re-articulated into other idioms. The Church's rhetorical triumph produced an odd aftermath. The public death of an institution coincided with the diffusion of its language into confession, cure, and culture. The accusation of heresy made Manichaeism illegible as a legal religion, but legible as a set of symbols about human interiority. The paradox is stark. Heresy won by losing. Exiled texts, fragmentary manuscripts, and polemical refutations together fed a continuing intellectual appetite for dualist schemata. In the subsequent centuries, those patterns did not vanish so much as migrate into mystical speculation, into folk cosmologies, into the psychiatric and literary vocabularies that later thinkers and artists would draw upon. Jung's archetypal theory, for example, reframed the drama of light and shadow as psychic structures. Freud's mapping of drives and resistances recapitulated a battlefield within the self. Popular myth-making carried the motif further still. From medieval heresiologists to modern screenwriters, the image of an inner war between luminous and dark forces persisted, retooled for new audiences across an Atlantic to Pacific cultural horizon. The survival of a framework after the institutional body that housed it was destroyed becomes the essential nexus. Ideas outlive institutions because they offer maps for experience that are portable, memorizable, and emotionally resonant. Manichean dualism supplied such a map. It fitted neatly into therapeutic narratives of moral transformation, into dream interpretation schemes, into novels and films that stage moral crises as cosmic struggles. Star Wars is a crude but telling cultural descendant. Its moral polarity, its language of temptation and redemption, its charismatic teachers and corrupted initiates echo the motifs once prescribed as heretical. The result is a strange legacy. The Church declared Manichaeism a heresy and thereby underlined the potency of the very distinctions that would later be translated into psychology, myth, and mass culture. This trajectory reframes suppression as a stage, not a terminus. Declaring a movement heretical and dismantling its institutions removes an organized competitor but also concentrates its symbolic capital into new forms. Those forms, less visible as cults and more durable as images and conceptual tools, helped build intellectual infrastructures for later reflection on consciousness and identity. In that sense, the institutional victory over Manichaeism in Rome did not end the conversation about inner light and outer law. It exported the conversation into other disciplines and media. The confession of an ex-follower became, paradoxically, one of the vectors by which a suppressed theology mutated into a perennial grammar for thinking about the human soul. Augustine turns prosecutor, bishop writes against former faith. Augustine's 9-year immersion in Manichaean belief left a map inside him that he could neither erase nor simply repudiate. His confessions records an inner theater of voices, prayers, doubts, and secret pleasures, a man speaking to himself and to God, narrating temptations as if they were characters on a stage. He carried that inner stage into his episcopal ministry, but he now sat on the other side of the bar, prosecutor, judge, and refuter. The switch was not merely institutional. It was intimate. The very introspective language that had once justified Manichaean readings of light and dark became the instrument with which he exposed their inconsistencies. He set his prodigious rhetorical gifts against his former teachers in a sequence of polemical works, most famously Contra Faustum and the series known collectively as Against the Manicheans, deploying scriptural exegesis, logical critique, and patient dismantling of dualist cosmology. He did not merely attack doctrines at arm's length. Augustine traced how Manichaean answers to suffering and sin had shaped the way he had felt and argued when young, and he methodically reclaimed that interior terrain. Short sentences pierce here and there, like a prosecutor's pointed questions. Longer passages surround them, reconstructing arguments, quoting interlocutors, and reflecting on the psychology of belief. He argued that evil could not be an independent substance set in eternal opposition to good. Instead, he reformulated evil as privation, a corruption of being that explains moral responsibility and personal guilt. In doing so, he repurposed the intimate grammar of confession, the same language of inner voices, divided desire, and moral self-scrutiny, into a corrective framework that would be read and reread across the Mediterranean and beyond. The irony is striking and philosophically rich. By articulating the problem of evil so fully and by dramatizing inner conflict and confession, Augustine ensured that the questions Manichaeism posed would outlast the sect itself. Manichaeism as an institution faltered. Its palaces of hierarchy and missionary networks decayed. Yet its basic metaphors, light and darkness, a cosmos locked in moral warfare, a split interior life, survived in more diffuse, resilient forms. Analysts centuries later would recognize the same motifs. Jung drew upon Gnostic and dualist imagery when he described the shadow and the process of individuation. Freud's portrait of a conflicted psyche, torn between drives and rules, echoes the tension Augustine laid bare in his own soul. Even modern myth-making, exemplified by the galactic binaries of stories like Star Wars, recycles that elemental language of cosmic struggle. The theological defeat of Manichaeism became, paradoxically, a cultural and intellectual victory, the heresy won by losing. That paradox matters for how we understand the foundations of modern self-understanding. Augustine's conversion and subsequent prosecution of Manichaeism institutionalized a certain model of interiority, self-examination, narrative confession, relentless interrogation of motives, that would become a template for therapies, philosophies, and literary forms from one shore to the next. Across the Atlantic and reaching toward the Pacific, scholars, artists, and clinicians have drawn, sometimes consciously and often unconsciously, on the Augustinian frame. A staged inner life, culpability and grace, the quest to render private tumult into public language. In short, Augustine's pen closed some doors and opened others. His refutations preserve the very dilemmas that had once made him a believer. The result is a legacy in which doctrines perish, but their questions seed new disciplines: psychology, narrative identity, cultural myth. The bishop who once prosecuted his former faith thus stands at the nexus where theology, selfhood, and global imagination converge, proving that ideas can travel farther than institutions and that a lost heresy can live on as the scaffolding of modern thought. China ban 845 CE, anti-foreign persecution. When Emperor Wuzong of Tang ordered the Huichang Edict, the campaign was explicit in its target. Foreign religions perceived as apart from native order were to be suppressed, their temples closed, their clergy laicized, and their wealth transferred to the state. Buddhism bore the brunt of the crackdown, but the imperial decree also swept away the institutional presence of other imported faiths, Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrians, and Manicheans among them. The imperial rationale mixed fiscal calculation with cultural anxieties. Monasteries and foreign religious houses had become repositories of land and wealth, and an ascendant court faction, loyal to Taoist ritual and imperial consolidation, saw a political opportunity in curbing their reach. At the same moment, the Uyghur Khaganate, long a protector of Manichean communities across the steppe, had collapsed. The loss of that external patronage left Chinese Manicheans exposed to an unforgiving crackdown. Manichaeism in China had never been merely an exotic transplant. It had adapted, taken Chinese names, and nested among Sogdian merchant networks and Silk Road settlements that braided Atlantic to Pacific exchanges into daily life. Known in Chinese records as Manicheo, often translated as the teachings of Mani, or simply the light religion, it appears in administrative lists and polemics alike, an acknowledged presence in the urban pluralism of late Tang capitals. The Huichang measures forced these communities to either disperse or to fold inward. Ritual texts were hidden, clergy merged with local guilds, iconography was repurposed, and belief was folded into household piety. Surviving Manichean rituals and ideas were often rendered unrecognizable on the surface, yet the core dualistic imagery and ethical insistencies persisted and localized, syncretic practices long after the state apparatus had declared the faith null. Augustine's old, inward voice still remembers what it is to be a convert, to have lived 9 years within a faith that promised cosmic clarity. He speaks here not as a distant North African bishop, but as an interior witness to a wider human pattern, zeal that once sought total truth, questions that would not be answered by institutional power, and the strange solace of a doctrine that set the world into strict poles of light and darkness. His confession, its memory of Manichean ritual and argument, reads across space to the Tang court's purges and says, softly and with complex irony, that being uprooted does not annihilate the choreography of belief. The private life of an idea can survive the public destruction of its temples. The paradox is the ecclesiastical conundrum and the modern axiom: heresy won by losing. When Manichaean institutions were smashed in palace precincts and provincial towns, the faith's binary metaphors and diagnostic grammar of the soul did not die. They migrated into new vocabularies. Jung would later excavate a language of shadow and archetype that mirrors the Manichaean map of light and darkness, and psychoanalytic grammars that speak of drives and counterdrives trace a conceptual kinship with earlier dualisms. Popular mythmaking. Think of galactic epics that stage light against dark with moral urgency. Keeps the same cosmic scaffolding alive. In that sense, the Huichang ban was less an annihilation than a decisive conversion of doctrine from public creed to cultural substrate, feeding later psychology, literature, and spiritual imagination across Eurasia and beyond. Ideas outlive institutions. Systems of thought relocate into language, dream, and discipline. And the Manichaean frame, though institutionally crushed in mid-Tang China, continued to shape how minds, individual and collective, saw conflict, choice, and redemption. The nexus framework survived institution death. Manichaean thought did not die with its hierarchies. Its scaffolding migrated. Texts and fragmentary liturgies in Coptic, Middle Persian, Syriac, and Chinese attest to a doctrine that once spanned from the Mediterranean basin to the far reaches of East Asia, carried along trade routes and language borders. Augustine's 9-year confession of belonging to the Manichaeans, later laid bare in his introspective writings, furnishes a direct example of how the religion lodged itself inside minds even after institutions crumbled. His internal voice, his wrestle with light and darkness, became part of the vocabulary of Western interiority. Scholars point to those surviving manuscripts and doctrinal echoes as the connective tissue that allowed a world-denying dualism to outlive the clerical structures that bore it. The paradox is plain and paradoxical. By losing its institutional power, Manichaeism diffused into other systems, and so in effect won. Elements of its cosmology: light trapped within matter, a salvific knowledge that aims to liberate sparks, a universe staged as moral warfare, were absorbed, translated, and secularized. In Christian polemics, they became motifs to be argued against, and, in being argued against, were clarified and recorded. In Islamic theology, and in certain Gnostic currents, they were adapted into debates about predestination, evil, and the nature of the soul. The result is not mere survival, but transformation. The ancient binary of luminous and shadow informs medieval mysticism, informs allegorical literature, and reappears in philosophical vocabularies about mind and world. This set of ideas furnished metaphors that modern psychology could appropriate without the old rites. Freud reframed existential opposition as intrapsychic conflict, id, ego, superego, and thus turned cosmic warfare into clinical architecture. Jung did more overtly. He treated light and darkness as archetypal forces, wrote extensively on Gnostic symbolism, and described the shadow as a necessary counterpart to consciousness. Their vocabularies owe something to a broader cultural inheritance in which Manichaean imagery had already become a lingua franca for internal struggle. Therapists today still guide patients in narratives of extraction and return, recovering lost light, integrating the shadow, an echo of doctrines that once insisted salvation required liberation from material captivity. Across the Atlantic to Pacific sweep of civilizations, the same structural motifs recur in surprising guises. George Lucas tapped the archetype for the masses when he articulated a force divided into light and dark, and millions recognized in that binary the moral grammar learned elsewhere in scripture, folklore, and private confession. Academic psychology and popular myth-making therefore share a debt. Both inherited a framework that explains corruption, redemption, and knowledge as linked processes. The claim that heresy won by losing captures a dynamic where institutional defeat dispersed potent metaphors into the cultural bloodstream, making them more resilient than any centralized church could be. Practical consequences follow for how we read cultural continuities. When therapists map internal conflict, when filmmakers stage epic duels, when theologians argue about theodicy, they are often using a set of structural tools that outlive the Manichaean priesthood. The nexus is conceptual rather than organizational, an enduring framework that translated ritual claims about cosmic light into psychological grammars and narrative archetypes. In that way, the faith's most durable legacy is not a building or a hierarchy, but an interpretive engine, one that reappears in Augustine's interior monologue, in Freudian clinical models, in Jungian archetypes, and in the mythic economies of modern storytelling. The institution fell. The idea did not just survive. It retooled itself into the language of conscience and psyche, proving that some doctrines are less fragile than their churches. Psychology Foundation, Jung's shadow, Freud ego/id, light/dark binary. When Augustine confessed the turbulence of his inner life during his 9-year entanglement with Manichaeism, he gave language to a psychological drama that would outlast doctrinal collapse. He described an internal voice caught between impulses and ideals, a personal theater where light and dark were not metaphysical abstractions alone, but lived experiences, shame, desire, rational aspiration, and dread intermingling. That autobiographical testimony functions as an early case study in projection. The soul externalizes its dark parts, names them, and seeks allies or enemies outside itself. It is an intimate map of how dualistic cosmology translates into intrapsychic architecture. The Manichean light/dark binary operates psychologically as a clarifying metaphor and a dangerous shortcut. By positing absolute, externalized principles of good and evil, it encouraged the splitting of the self into pure and impure poles. In clinical terms, that split becomes projection. Unwanted impulses are cast outward onto scapegoats, institutions, or heresies. Therapy reverses the move by bringing the projected shadow back into conscious relation. Consider a person who condemns another for selfishness while denying the same urge within. The moral certainty borrowed from dualism feels clean, but it conceals internal conflict. This dynamic underpins many modern therapeutic observations without requiring allegiance to any creed. Freud translated the drama into structural psychology, with the ID as the blind reservoir of drives and the ego as mediator. The echo is unmistakable. The ID's chaotic appetite resembles the dark principle, and the ego's labor to negotiate reality resembles the hesitant light. Defense mechanisms become battleground strategies, compromises between impulses and ideals. Patients who externalize blame or split loyalties illustrate Freud's point that inner antagonisms are negotiated rather than annihilated. Freud did not adopt Manichaean metaphysics, yet his map of competing psychic forces recasts the ancient binary into functional terms that clinicians use every day. Jung, for his part, made the shadow an archetype and a mandate. He insisted that what is denied festers, and that individuation requires a conscious encounter with one's darkness. Archetypal images, myths, and symbols from across the Atlantic to Pacific cultural landscape, from Mediterranean confessional literature to East Asian mythic motifs and contemporary cinema, offer templates for this integration. Cultural artifacts carry these themes too. Popular narratives like Star Wars repurpose the same drama in a secular key, with the dark side and the shadow externalized on screens, yet intimate in viewers' minds. Jung's alchemical analogies and interest in Gnostic motifs show how psychological practice absorbs and reframes religious binaries into therapeutic processes. The paradox is stark: heresy won by losing. Institutional Manichaeism faded, but its cognitive architecture, an appetite for clear moral binaries, projection of evil, and the need for reintegration, survived and migrated into psychology and popular culture. Ideas outlive institutions. Freud's descriptive mechanisms and Jung's integrative ethic repurposed dualistic intuitions into tools for understanding and healing the self. Across oceans and languages, from Augustine's inward confession to clinicians mediating modern conflicts, the light/dark binary endures not as dogma, but as a durable lens, one that warns against simple repudiation of the dark and urges a courageous, philosophical reconciliation within. Conclusion: ideas outlive institutions, heresy won by losing. Manichaean dualism cast a long shadow across the Mediterranean basin, the Persian plateau, and along the trade arteries that reached toward the Pacific, seeding concepts of cosmic opposition, light versus darkness, spirit versus matter, that outlived the institutions that first carried them. The religion itself dissolved in many regions, yet its vocabulary and diagnostic categories for evil, inner struggle, and moral clarity were absorbed into rival theologies, polemical literature, and popular imagination. Augustine's own record is a vivid example. He confessed an internal allegiance during a 9-year Manichean phase, an inward voice that he later scrutinized and repudiated in his writings. Yet the encounter left him wrestling with the problem of evil in ways that shaped Western theology long after Manichaeism's organizational decline. The paradox is clear. Defeat in institutional terms did not erase the cognitive and symbolic patterns that had been disseminated across languages and cultures. Networks of transmission explain part of this persistence. Texts survived in fragments. Translations into Syriac, Coptic, Middle Persian, and later was preserved in the writings of opponents and inquisitors who quoted doctrines they meant to rebut. Those hostile accounts, combined with archaeological discoveries and recovered manuscripts, show how the ideas migrated, mutated, and nested inside other systems. In practice, losing the temple or the hierarchy often made Manichaean motifs more portable, stripped of strict orthodoxy. Dualistic narrative could be grafted onto Christian moral discourse, Islamic heresiology, medieval mysticism, and folk cosmologies on both continents. Once uncoupled from a single, enforceable institution, doctrine became mimetic, capable of recombination, allegory, and psychological interiorization. The influence extends forward into disciplines that never claim descent from that faith, but nonetheless reuse its framings. Carl Jung engaged deeply with Gnostic and dualistic imagery and recognized the utility of polarized myth for describing the conscious-unconscious dialectic. His archetype of the shadow resonates closely with the Manichaean map of inner darkness that must be integrated or overcome. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic language operates differently, yet it also redistributes moral and metaphysical conflict into psychic structures, turning cosmic opposition into intrapsychic drama. Popular culture offers the clearest everyday echo. The mythic scaffold of a radiant light side arrayed against an alluring dark side in blockbuster space opera universes channels a global audience into a cognitive landscape that resembles ancient dualism. It is not literal descent, but a conceptual lineage. Ideas that once organized communal ritual now organize mythic imagination and therapeutic models alike. This is why the phrase, heresy won by losing, is not mere paradox, but a precise description of cultural evolution. Institutional collapse allowed hermeneutic flexibility. Opposition produced preservation. When official custodians annihilated rival institutions, they often wrote the rival out of existence only by documenting it. And that documentation became the vector through which the rival's concepts entered mainstream thought. Augustine's internal confession illustrates the point on a human scale. He rejected the movement publicly, yet the cognitive imprint remained, informing debates about free will, theodicy, and interior sin. In the centuries that followed, the cognitive framework, binarism, the spatialization of morality, the personification of abstract forces, became a resource for theologians, philosophers, poets, and physicians who reshaped those patterns into new wholeness. Viewed from Atlantic shores to Pacific horizons, the real legacy of Manichaeism is methodological rather than institutional. It contributed a way of framing questions, how to map good and evil across realms, how to read personal conflict as cosmic drama, how to translate metaphysics into language for counsel and cure. Modern psychology borrowed that schematic capacity, turning externalized moral antagonisms into diagnosable processes within the psyche. Jung's symbolic therapy, with its emphasis on integrating opposites, and psychodynamic approaches that treat internal conflict as narrative, both owe something to the dualistic grammar that travels back through antiquity. Even in secular contexts, the metaphor survives because it is pragmatic. It helps people segregate experience, name their suffering, and imagine paths toward reconciliation. Ultimately, ideas behave like seeds cast beyond the place that bred them. They take root in unexpected soils, hybridize, and bloom in forms unrecognizable to their originators. Manichaeism's institutional death proved to be an unexpected vector for diffusion. The absence of a centralized, policing apparatus permitted diffusion through translation, refutation, appropriation, and artistic reinvention. Heresy thereby triumphed not by institutional continuity, but by becoming a structural instrument of thought, an enduring, transcontinental grammar for interpreting conflict, one that continues to inform theology, psychology, and storytelling across oceans and generations. From the river valleys of the Fertile Crescent to the trade winds that carried goods and ideas from the Atlantic to the Pacific, Manichaeism was an ambitious attempt to stitch together a broken world with a single story. Light and darkness locked in eternal combat, the cosmos itself a battleground for souls. Founded by Mani, it traveled with merchants, monks, and missionaries across empires, sowing a moral grammar that could be translated into Syriac, Latin, Persian, Uyghur, and Chinese. It was at once a religion, a philosophy, and a missionary blueprint, universal in claim, local in practice. Key points to remember. Manichaeism's dualism offered a clear map for moral life. Its missionary zeal made it one of the first truly transcontinental faiths. Persecution and doctrinal rivalry destroyed its institutions, but not its ideas. Those ideas refract forward into the modern mind. Augustine remembered his own 9 years inside that movement with an inner voice that still speaks across centuries. For 9 years first walked with them, seeking light and fearing darkness. First learned to read the world in halves and longed for a whole. His confession is not merely a biographical footnote. It is proof that an idea can lodge in a single consciousness and change the course of thought. The paradox at the heart of this story is simple and strange. Heresy won by losing. When the hulks of Manichean communities were smashed, their doctrines scattered, absorbed, reinterpreted, and germinated in strange soils. The nexus is not an institution but a pattern, a framework of oppositions and reconciliations that survived the death of organizations and reappeared in new guises. We see its echoes in the languages of modern psychology, Freud's conflicts, Jung's shadow and archetype, and in our stories and myths, from high literature to blockbuster cinema. Even Star Wars, with its cosmic tug-of-war between light and dark, testifies to a narrative architecture that Mani helped popularize, the inner battlefield as the decisive theater of human life. Ideas outlive institutions. A doctrine that seemed routed by emperors and inquisitors instead flowed into philosophical vocabularies, therapeutic models, and cultural metaphors. It became part of the toolkit by which we name suffering, temptation, conscience, and liberation. That is the real legacy, not temples or hierarchies, but frames of meaning that shape how people think about inner conflict and moral choice. The very foundations upon which parts of modern psychology were later built. Why does this matter for you? Because the ancient map of light and dark is still the map we use when we talk about ethics, mental health, and social struggle. When you argue with yourself, when you diagnose a pattern of thought, when you tell a story about redemption or fall, you are, whether you know it or not, in conversation with a voice that crossed continents a millennium ago. Knowing that lineage gives context to your inner life and perspective on the languages we use to heal it. If this journey intrigued you, stay with us. Subscribe and follow for more explorations of how ancient ideas haunt the modern world. Next time, we'll trace Manichaean currents eastward into China and beyond, and unpack how those dualistic schemas were translated into practices that anticipated aspects of psychotherapy and cultural storytelling. We'll meet thinkers, survivors, and symbols that show how an apparently defeated faith kept changing minds. Ideas are stubborn. Institutions fall, martyrs die, texts burn, but frameworks persist, carried in memory, habit, narrative, and the human need to make sense of struggle. Manichaeism did not vanish so much as transform. In losing its outward power, it gained a quieter immortality. That paradox, heresy won by losing, is the last lesson. The world is always made by stories, and the oldest ones still hold the power to shape how we see ourselves, from the Atlantic shores to the Pacific horizon.